G'day, I'm George Smithwick. I just happen to be a 6th generation cooper. Pretty lucky, I guess, but I've been doing it now for 30 odd years and I've had a great time doing it. It's interesting to show people how these things are done because there's not many of us left, and let's hope it carries on at some point. Well, the word cooper is a Latin word, and coop means to contain. So as it evolved, the word cooper became, and it's a person who builds barrels, buckets, any vessel that holds either a fluid or a sausage skin. It just means to contain it within an area. So that's where coopering come from, and there's various sides to coopering. You've got white coopering, which is someone who makes either buckets or butter churns or barrels for milk or cream or butter. Then you've got a dry cooper, is a person who just makes dry goods barrels for transporting fruit or sausage skins, olives, any of those. And then you've got a wet cooper who makes wine barrels, beer barrels, also makes buckets, anything that has to be watertight or fluid tight. I fortunately cover the whole lot of them. Right. in what I've been doing over the last 30 years. I've made dry goods barrels, I make buckets, I make butter churns, I make wine barrels, beer barrels. So for me, I've just covered the whole lot. I'm lucky. The steps in making a bucket are, first of all, you joint the staves, then you hollow them and back them. Right. If you look closely, you'll note there's a gap between the hoop and the back of the stave. What I'm going to do now is called backing off the stave. I'm going to knock off each corner so it fits neatly into that hoop. So to do that, I sit my backside down here, and with this draw knife, which is called a backing iron, you will note it is curved, so it allows me to follow the shape of the hoop. So by putting it in, and it's just like a vice, I just sit there and back it off. Now that, if I've done it right, should fit neatly up against that. Get that little shaving out. You'll note that that's now fitting neatly up against the stave. So by the time I've done 18, which will go into making this bucket, they'll all be nice and tight up against that hoop. So I get pressure on every joint all the way around. So we sit ourselves down. We sit here and enjoy life. And you may think that I'm doing this, if you like, fast, but after you've done quite a few hundred of these staves, you know exactly how much you've got to take off without even looking at it. You know you've got it right. What we're about to do is what's called raising up the barrel or the bucket. In this case it is a bucket, so we're raising it up. So I put a stave in, I put a clip on it to hold it in place, and the staves I'm putting in now are the handles of the bucket. The first two are always the handles. Get them approximately opposite each other. So now I have to fill it up. So I just stand them up in there and work my way around. Now we put the top hoop on, which is a bar hoop, which is, as you can see, they're quite heavy hoops. Now we've got to level up the bottom of the bucket by getting all of these staves to be level. So to do that, I just pick a point to start, using my finger as a gauge to feel the bottom of it. I just tap the staves up. Feels fairly good. Now drive this hoop down. Right, now we've got that nice and level on the bottom. When I did this bucket, I felt the bottom of these to level them off. And that's easy on a small bucket or a small barrel. But if this were a big barrel, to get it flush on the top, you'd use what's called a topping plane. Now you'll notice it's curved so it follows the shape of the barrel or the bucket that you're doing. So it would be just a matter of putting it on and working it around like that until you got that bottom flat. On a big barrel, it's hard to use your finger to gauge them to get them all nice and level. Buckets, well, that's easy. So on the big barrels, you just use a topping plane. And it's just a nice sharp tool, follows the shape of the barrel. Right, our next job now is to cut a groove inside here to take the head or the bottom of the bucket. So by using this tool, what's called a crow's, it's got two little scribers and a raker. So by sitting that inside there and racking it around, I can cut a groove in there. Now it's just a matter of checking, make sure I'm deep enough all the way around. And I can see a couple of spots where I'm not. Right, I reckon that'll just about do me. So now we've got to work out the circumference of that to find out the radius for the head. At this point, I'm measuring the circumference of this groove that I've put in so I can find out the radius for the head to go in there. Now, if I go exactly, I'll mark that so you can see where I'm starting there. If I go exactly 6 times around that circumference, it will give me the radius. But having said that, what I've done, I've gone approximately 1/4 of an inch past that joint, so I've physically made the diameter a little bit bigger. So the reason for doing that is that if I measure 1/2 of the circle, now if I turn that head around, I'll step the compass back 1/2 of what I went past, being almost 1/4 of an inch, and I will mark the other 1/2 of the circle. Now the reason for stepping it back 1/2 of what I went past is it now makes the diameter right in the length of the grain, but slightly wider in the width. 2 reasons for that. Timber is softer in its width than it is in its length, but it also shrinks in its width. If this was a jointed head, it would have a join down there or there or there, and it'd have a bit of kabungi in it, which is a flag to stop it from leaking. So being wider, it's going to put pressure on those joints and squash them all nice and tight. Now what I've got to do is cut this so that I can shave it down to the right size. If you look at that, you'll see that I've cut right down the middle of the line. So I'm now making it just a little bit smaller in diameter, and that is so to allow it to go neatly into the bottom of that groove. And to get that right, my angles when I shave it have to be perfect to get that tight. Now what I've done now, I've put a rough centre line around that so that I can work out now how wide my groove has to be. I'll just eye it to that centre line. I won't worry about putting two lines, and I just put a rough line around here so I know where to come back to with the angle of me head. And they're only rough lines. I'm only finger gauging them, so nothing special. All right. What I've got now, I've shaved the head down, so I've tapered it so that that will fit into the groove. Now, it's only I that's telling me that that's right. After having done so many heads, you get to know when you've got your angles right and your width of your groove right. So now I've looked at that around there, and I reckon I'm pretty close to right. So now we're going to knock that hoop off. We're going to put some linseed meal, which is just at the minute it's a paste. It starts out as a powder. After they extract the oil out of linseed, they crush up the seed and make it into a powder. I put a little bit of water with it, turn it into a paste. When that dries inside that groove, if the bucket ever thinks it's going to leak, this will expand and take up and it won't leak. It'll stop it from leaking. So now I've got to drive this hoop off so I can get the head in. Nothing technical about putting this in, it's just a matter of squeeze it into the groove. We've got to be careful we don't have too much in there, because if I put too much in there, it's going to stop the head from going in and seating in properly. So I'll go around it like this, poke it all in, and then I'll scrape some out at the end so I know I've got just the right amount in there. Now it's a matter of poke the head in. As I poke this head into the bottom of the bucket, you will notice that the staves will start to open up. They'll get a gap in them. But if I get that down into the groove, they should all just close up nicely, or very close to closed up. Now it's gone a little bit far in one point. Pop, he's in. Now to drive this hoop back on, what I'll do, I'll chalk the inside of this hoop. You may think that the chalk will help it slip on easier, but what it does, it makes the hoop stick. It'll stick to the timber. It gives it like a sandpapered edge. So now just drive that hoop back up. And if I've got it right, you'll note there'll be little bits of that linseed meal start squeezing out. Now, to make sure I've got that staves seated down around that head, I go around the outside and just tap it until they all seat down neatly. Now it's just look at it, see that it appears to be sat down neatly. You'll note there's little bits of linseed meal oozing out of the joint, so that's a real good sign that we've got a nice tight fit. Right, now we're going to sit back on the workhorse. We're going to shave the outside of this to get it to a relatively round shape so we can fit hoops to it, all right? So I'm back down on the donkey or the workhorse, whatever.
Righto, let's bend a hoop. I'm splaying the hoop because this now, as you can see, is a fairly straight piece of iron, hoop iron. I've got to turn it into a circle, but I also have to have it so that it follows the shape of the bucket. To do that, by hitting on one side of that piece of metal, I can physically spread it. So if you're going to be a bit of banging and clanging, but you'll see it happen. You can see it's starting to curve already. Now if you look at the side of that, you can see I've put an angle onto it. So that now will follow the shape of that bucket. By the time I pull that around and mark it and put the rivet through it, it'll fit perfectly to that. So you see that slight angle on it? That's enough to follow the shape of the bucket. I put the hoop around the bucket approximately where I want it to finish up, and I mark it about 3/8 of an inch past the end of that overlap. When I put the rivets in, I'll bring the hoop up to that chalk mark, and that'll give me a nice tight fit where it needs to be. You'll note I've got holes in one end of the hoop already. I put that across to the overlap. I sit it on top of the rivet, and I'm going to hit on top of there and punch the rivet up through it. So now if you look where that outside hoop goes around and the inside, there's a step, there's a gap. So if I hit right at the end of that, I can bring the outside to meet the inside. So it's about put it back on the bic iron and just hit right at the end of it. Now you can see the outsides come down to meet the inside. By the time I put that on there now, it'll come down nice and flat. Now that hoop will not go over the top of that one, so I've got to knock that hoop off to get it on. Now just run it around to look and see that it's relatively straight around the bucket, which it is. Now it's a matter of trim off the bottom, put the chime hoop on. This one, when I put it on, I put about half of the hoop sticking up, so I know when I get it down I can get it to pull right down tight. Now you'll see more linseed meal oozing out. Just that bit tighter again. I'll be happy with that. Now I've just got to level off the top of it, round it over a little bit, so there's no sharp points for anyone to hurt themselves. Now comes the good part, the fun part. Bit of rope handle. We're putting an eye splice for the handle. So if I pick up roughly how big I want the eye of the loop to be, and what I've done, I've opened up the rope into three cords, and I start out with the middle one. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, always start with the middle. So having determined where my eye is going to start, I just open the rope up like that, and I feed the middle one through that hole, pull it up, turn it around and open the next one up. Poke it through, pull it up, go backwards, open it up again, pull it through. So now I'm back to where I was. I've still got 1, 2, 3. So it's now back, start with the middle one again, open it up, poke it through. Go around one, poke it through. Go back 2 and poke it through. And then pull it up again. Just holding it tight here and pulling it upwards just gets it to sit down nice and neatly. And it's back to the middle one again. And poke it through.
And will you tie it off?
Nope. No. Once I get that up through there and I trim it off, it'll be as neat as a pin. Now just rub it together to get it nice and neat. And it's pick how long you want the handle to be. Some people like to lay it over and work out where they want it to hang. I've done quite a few, so I know roughly where it's going to hang. So now it's just cut my rope. Turn it around and start again. Open it up. Normally open it up 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And then back to my middle one again. Get that right. Always start with the middle one. If you don't start with the middle, you're going to be in all sorts of bother. It's a bit short. And as you do it, you've got to be careful not to fray the end of the rope, otherwise it makes it hard to poke it through. And it becomes very untidy. This in itself was another trade on the ships. Sail makers and rope makers and splicers, and that was another job again. So everybody had their own little job on the ships, along with coopers and cooks and everything else.
And so the coopers would have relied on these other tradesmen to produce the rope for their buckets.
Yep. Yeah.
But today you're
Yeah,
covering all those trades.
Yeah, yeah. I don't go to the extent of making the rope, but I must admit. Now just pull that down into place. Now just trim off the ends with a nice sharp knife. There we have it. Now all we have to do is make sure it doesn't leak. We'll get a bit of water in it first. We'll put a bit in it. Well, that's not leaking, I don't reckon. I'll put that up. No leaks. I can't see any. Nah, that'll do me. That's it. Bucket done. It's made out of kauri pine, and for buckets I use kauri pine because it will not impart any flavour into the water or milk or that you put in that bucket. If I used a mountain ash overnight with water in it, the water would turn blue. You could still drink it, but you'd have a flavour in it, so it wouldn't be nice. So in Australia for white cooperage they used kauri pine because there was plenty of it, and it's just one of those timbers. It's a food grade timber. It doesn't impart any flavour into anything, so that's why they used it. In Europe they use beech, they use chestnut. They're probably the only ones that they use over there for white cooperage. Dry goods, well, it doesn't matter, you can use just about any timber as long as you can bend it. So, and dry cooperage's barrels are fairly straight. There's not much bilge in them, the bilge being the curve in a barrel. So they're easy to bend. Wet cooperage, depending on what it was for, if it was for oil, it didn't matter on the timber. If it's for beer or wine, 9 times out of 10 it's oak.
What's your favourite wood?
Oh, it has to be oak. It's just a beautiful timber. It's French oak, English oak, Memel oak. All of the European oaks are fairly soft. When I say soft, they're clean to work. They're nice to work with. American oak's a bit harder. Got a little bit more angry grain in it, but it's still a nice timber to work. But if I had my choice, it'd be French oak or English oak. Yeah.
And what's it like working with your hands for a job?
What's it like? Crikey. I don't know anything else, so
Are your hands your most valuable tool?
Oh yeah. It's obviously your brain tells your hands what to do, but to me, I feel it's the other way around. It's my hands that are telling me brain that that's how it's working. But nah, if I didn't have hands, I'd be lost.
These buckets will end up in the hands of children, and they'll be using them to do hand washing and see what it was like to do it in the past. Do you think that's an important thing for them to have access to?
Oh, of course it is, yeah. I mean, that's part of the problem today with a lot of things. They don't appreciate where things come from, how they were done and how they got to where they are now. Or now we've got plastic buckets, but plastic buckets blow away, wooden buckets don't. Wooden bucket will still sit there in a 40-mile-an-hour wind. A plastic bucket will be gone, you won't see it. You know?
How far can you go back with your family history? You said you're sixth generation.
Yeah, well, what's that make it? My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Yeah.
So it goes back a bit.
And you know quite a bit about up to your grandfather, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
Not much beyond.
I never ever met my great-grandfather, but he just happened to die on a date a few years apart, obviously. He died on the 30th of the 11th, and I was born on the 30th of the 11th. Yeah. Quite a few years apart, but yeah, there's got to be something in that.
Yeah.
So, you know, what do? You have those sort of things happening in your life, you've got to end up doing what they did, don't you? You know.
So would his generation have been one of the last generations that was really working as a full-time cooper in the traditional sense, or did it?
No, my father was working as a cooper as a traditional job. He worked at Maize Products, the Federal Cask Company, and then ended up at Carlton United Breweries, but prior to that he worked at the Yorkshire Brewery and the Abbotsford Brewery, and then they were all taken over by Carlton United, and he ended up his working life, or not his working life, but until they closed down the Cooper shop in 1954, I think it was. It holds water. What more do you want? I've made a living out of making buckets. It's a practical thing. If someone's to buy this bucket, I know they're going to have this bucket in 30 years' time if they look after it. It's a practical thing. You know? What more can you ask from a bucket? It's a bit of wood. You've created something. In a lot of cooperages, it was common practice to pre-bend your staves, so they'd be pre-bent to not the exact bend that they were going to end up, but being pre-bent, it meant that you could joint them just by holding them on a plane like this and then just running them across to get the right angle on the side of the stave so that the next one butted up to it and you went around. So that was common practice, but prior to that, pre-bending them, they would use what's called a side axe, and that's just a bloody big axe, and they would pre-shape their stave. So if you look at that side of the stave, it's got a bit of a bend in it, but it's relatively straight. But this side I've already knocked a bit off, so you can see that it's got that curve on it. So then it would be back to this jointer again, but you would work it differently. You would only do one half and then turn it around and do the other half. And then once you got it almost right, you would push it down, but you would run your stave upwards like that. So it followed that curve around the outside. It was basically the same thing. Now these bits of tools that I've got laying here on the floor, they all had their little jobs. When you're hollowing the inside of a stave so that it follows the inside shape of the barrel, you would use an inside shave, which is like that draw knife I was using earlier, which was a backing iron, this is curved the other way and sharpened the opposite way. You can see the curve in it, so that then you can get the, by putting that into your block and holding it, you could shave the inside of your stave so that it got that nice inside shape. Or you could use what's called a bully plane. That's curved that way and that way. So it would be done the same, doing the same job as that inside shave, but you use it just a bit differently. So that would then do the same job. It got you hollow inside. Now, this is another type of draw knife. It's called a jigger. Crazy name, where they got that from I don't know. But when you've got your barrel all stood up, to make that nice and round on the inside, you would hang that inside it and just shave around like that. So you put that shape into the top of your barrel or your bucket. Was done with that tool there by suspending it inside, and that gives you that shape inside there. Then there was also that tool which was developed a little bit later. It does the same job as what the jigger does, but this is just a plane. It's a whole lot easier to operate. You sat that on top of your barrel and just rocked it around and it shaved it out. Then you put your groove in, which was done with that, and that, what we did on the buckets, does the same job. It cuts a groove into there. You can, just by running, that's sitting on top of the barrel, and that's adjustable in height, so you can lift that up and down to work out the gallonage of your barrel. If your stave was a little bit longer, needed to come down a bit further or up a bit further, you could adjust it by just adjusting that up and down in there. Then you've got your adze, which was used to put that shape into the top of the stave, and that's done by holding a barrel on a block and just chipping around like that, working around it.
And why do you need to put that?
When a barrel is on its end, you'll notice most barrels, wine barrels, the hoops sit up a little bit higher, so that when you're rolling a barrel, it's rolling on the hoop, not the timber. Occasionally they got down a bit lower, so they had it so they were only running on a little bit of the stave, not the whole lot of it. So that's one reason it was tapered in. The other reason is so you can slip your head in. You put your head in, when I did the buckets, I put it in from the inside. You can't do that with a barrel. You've got to push it in from the top. So it'll physically slide down that taper. Then you've got your, what's called a bung borer. It's just a tapered, knife-edged, semi-half or semi-auger. You drill a hole, a small hole into your barrel to stave, and then by putting that in it and turning it around, it gives you a tapered hole. So your bung would just tap in and stay in there. And there's all different shapes and sizes of these fellas too. That's just for the little barrels. That's called a flagging iron, and a flagging iron is used if you've got a slight leak in a barrel. You can, by taking that hoop off and loosening it a little, you can put that on there and physically pull that stave outwards, so you can put a little bit of flag in there, which is kabungi, a reed that grows in the dams. You can just slip it in the joint, and that just by putting it on your body and bending it, it'll pull that stave backwards. So. These are little homemade units. They're head pullers. They're for pulling heads up into barrels, and that's all they're used for, and no other reason. I don't know if you want to film it or not, but you can do that on one of those big barrels. So you've got your head poking down in there, you hook that little bit onto it, and then by lifting onto that rivet, you can pull the head upwards. It just pulls it up. They're just homemade little units. And an obvious thing, just a set of dividers, a compass set of dividers, just for working out your circumference or your diameter of your head. That's it. And that's just a smattering of tools. Well, it was extremely important because you needed to carry water. How were you going to carry water? In your hand? No. Someone had to make a bucket, or prior to that they had earthenware vessels, and that were pretty heavy and they broke easily, so as they worked along they figured out that they could make a wooden bucket. They did that. If you needed to store or make, say, sauerkraut, it's done in a bucket or a small barrel. Say you needed a watertight vessel, or in that case they were using salt and cabbage. I think they put a little bit of water in it, so it had to hold fluid. They just had to have them. Yeah, you made butter. How did you make butter? Beating the daylights out of a bit of cream. Where were you going to do it? Inside a bucket, inside a butter churn. So they'd just come up with systems to make life easy for everybody, and it just happened to be that a cooper was the bloke that got the job of doing those things. So yeah, he was very important. Well, in Australia, the Coopers Union was the biggest of any union in Australia. So, and I think they were disbanded in 70-something. They closed down the Coopers Union, but back in the early 20s and 30s, prior to the Depression and the Second World War, it was huge industry. They used it for everything, whether it was wine. Well, Australia, it was beer, wasn't it? So yeah, it was a big industry, yeah. And even still then they were using dry goods barrels for transporting sausage skins and olives and rice and flour. So yeah, it was big, real big. When I started work at 15, I originally wanted to be a commercial artist, but being colourblind, that doesn't work real good. So next best thing was do coopering. My dad did it, my grandfather did it, they all did it. But there was no cooper shops left in Victoria. And having said that, there was one. But in 1966 that closed down. I started work in 65, so I was advised not to do that, and Mum and Dad weren't keen on me going to Adelaide to learn it, so I took on cabinet making, which I did for quite a few years, and I loved it, I enjoyed it. When I got to, I think I was 39 or something, my father passed away, and my father had asked my mother to, they obviously talked about this, if I happened to go before you, can you put in the paper, last in a line, 5th generation Cooper? And that was all good, and we're down at the funeral parlour, and they're talking about this, and it didn't gel with me, so I said to my mother, I said, please don't put that in, and well, she didn't. It put me in, well, I put myself in a position where I didn't have any choice. I had to do it because I'd asked for that not to be done when he wanted it done. So I thought, well, to heck with it, I've got to do it. So I did it. I come home and, much to my wife's disgust, and threw in a good job. Come home and I had nothing, not a cent. Well, we obviously had money, but yeah. I didn't have a sale for a barrel or a bucket or anything, so oh, there we go, we'll make a few, and whizzed them around to a few wineries, and here we are 30 odd years later still doing it. So something worked, So it was worth it. Yeah,
And
I had fun.
You've got something very special here, don't you? That's in your collection.
Yeah, this is...
Can you tell us what that is and what it says?
This is a book on measurements for buckets and barrels and casks and that, and it was given to my father by a cooper at the Yorkshire Brewery, and it's got written on the inside of the front cover, given to Les Smithwick by Alec Cook, a cooper at the Yorkshire Brewery, Wellington Street, Collingwood, about 1942, with their strict instructions never to be shown to anybody else. And here we are, what are we, 2015, and I'm showing this to everybody. I hope they don't mind.
So what's exactly in there? That's a personal...
Yeah, it's all measurements that were written down by Alec Cook on, like the first page is on spirit casks, and it gives you the gallonage down this side, whether it's a 1 gallon up to a 16 gallon on that page. It gives you the length of the stave, how wide how big the barrel is on the end, and it gives you how big it is in the bilge, that being the fattest part of the barrel. So a one gallon barrel, it's 10.5 inches long. The diameter at the end is 6.5 inches. The bilge is 7.5 inches, and it would pass if it was 8.5 inches. And the pass means that at the bilge it could be either 7.5 or 8.5 inches. And to get the correct gallonage in it, if it's 7.5 inches, it means the head has to be closer to the end than what it does if it's 8.5 inches. So you've got to position your spot where you put your groove in. And they had a set of dividers which went inside the barrel to the groove, so that you knew you set that divider up, and that would tell you how far down your groove has to be. So yeah, but there's everything in there. Well, we've got port pipes on this page, and they go up to 46 gallons.
So these would have been standard measurements though?
Yep.
So why is it so important not to show it to someone else? What was the story behind that?
Damned if I know. Well, it was such a secretive industry. It was because they were all doing piecework. It was, the more barrels you made, the more money you got paid. So everything became a secret. You're not going to tell a bloke exactly how long he's got to make something. You're going to let him work that out for himself, aren't you?
Not give him the advantage.
Yeah, well, that's it. Not give your next bloke the advantage of doing things quicker than what you can do, because you've got this book and you know how long it has to be and you know what diameter it has to be. So why tell him? Yeah. That's why, I do. I tell everybody now, I don't care.
Well, now it's about sharing it.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's gone the full circle. Yeah, because they didn't do it all themselves. I mean, industry moved on, didn't it? That's why we have all this machinery, whereas at the start they didn't have this machinery, they were doing it all by hand. And now it's got to a stage where, well, now we've got plastic, we don't need wooden buckets. Well, some people still do, and I'm glad you do. But they've just become non-existent. We don't need them. Yeah. They're not a necessity anymore. Yeah, we still need them, but not like we used to need them. Yeah. That's it. I mean, I can remember going down the wharfs with my father. I was probably only about 14, and we'd buy old bourbon barrels and bring them home, and he'd tip 10 or 20 litres of boiling water inside the barrel, put the bung in, shake the living daylights out of it. 15, 20 minutes later, you had the best bourbon you could ever wish. Ooh, beautiful. Hey, that's not bad, eh?
So what lets a barrel down over time? Is it the same thing as a bucket, the jointing?
No. If a barrel or a bucket's been made properly in the first place, what is going to let it down is that it's left dry too long, or it's stored in a hot place. If it's stored in a cool place, it'll stay fairly tight. Even if it does leak a little bit, if it was made properly in the first place, you put a bit of water in it or amount of water in it or whatever in it, it will take up again. Might take a day, might take half a day, but it'll take up. If it didn't leak in the first place, it'll always become watertight again, always. The only thing that can go wrong is the staves will shrink more than what the head will. Right. So you may at some point have to recut a head in, but it'll still come back tight, always.